I want to give a shout out to our good friends at Blue Mics. If you've heard my voice on this show anytime over the past year, including right now, you've been listening to Blue microphones. And let me tell you, after more than 30 years in broadcasting, I don't think I have ever sounded better. But you don't need to be a pro or have a fancy studio to benefit from a quality mic. You may not realize it, but if you've been working from home or using Zoom to chat with friends, you probably spend a lot of time in front of a microphone. So why not sound your best? Whether you're doing video conferencing, podcasting, recording music, or hosting a talk show, Blue has you covered. From the USB series that plugs right into your computer to XLR professional mics like the Mouse or the Blueberry we use in the studio right now. Bottom line, there's a Blue microphone to fit your budget and need. I can't say enough about Blue mics, and once you try one, you will never go back. Trust me. To take your audio to the next level, go to drdrew.com/blue. That is drdrew.com/BLUE. Anyone who's watched me over the years knows that I'm obsessed with Hydralyte. In my opinion, the best oral rehydration product on the market. I literally use it every day. My family uses it. When I had COVID, I'm telling you, Hydralyte contributed to my recovery, kept me hydrated. Now, with things finally reopening back around the country, the potential exposure to the common cold is always around. And like always, Hydralyte has got your back. Hydralyte Plus Immunity, my new favorite, starts with their fast-absorbing electrolytes and adds a host of great ingredients. Plus, each single serving easy pour drink mix contains 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C, 300 milligrams of elderberry extract. Hydralyte Plus Immunity comes in convenient, easy to pour sticks that rapidly dissolve in water, make a great tasting drink, has 75% less sugar than your typical sports drink, uses all natural flavors, gluten-free, dairy-free, caffeine-free, non-GMO, and even vegan. Hydralyte Plus Immunity is also now available in ready-to-drink bottles at the Walmart next to the pharmacy, or as always, you can find it by visiting hydralyte.com/Dr. Drew. Again, that is hydralyte.com/DRDREW. Be sure to use the code Dr. Drew 25 for a special discount.
Oh, I was trying to be so smooth. Hey, everybody, it's a Dr. Drew.
Nice try, but that's what we call, folks.
It almost worked.
If you're ever in an interview for a job and you spill coffee or slip on a banana peel, it's supposed to endear you to the interlocutor. So I'm hoping that my wife has endeared herself to you by those gaffes. I know
figure out how that works.
People's patience with those gaffes only goes so far. So thank you for pushing the limits of that, Susan. We'll do a little social experiment to see how far that gets. But in all seriousness, today's a very interesting show. Gather around, folks. We have Dean Reuter in here, General Counsel for the Federal Society for Law and Public Policy. That is at the Federalist Society. He is also a fellow at the National Security Institute at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. Co-author of this book I'm going to tell you about. His previous book was Liberty's Nemesis, The Unchecked Expansion of the State and Confronting Terror, 9/11, and the Future of American National Security. You see the new book there alongside of me, The Hidden Nazi. This book caught my attention for a number of reasons, and let me just give you some highlights. It's the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, and it turns out that America may have shielded someone you've never heard of, a guy named Himmler. I beg your pardon. His name is Himmler.
Maybe
It's not
Dean
Himmler. He was with
us.
Himmler. He will tell me about it. Just give me a second. I want to get his name right. Shoot. I was all set to do that. Anyway, in any event, it's someone who you really, Kammler. You may not have heard this name. And yet he was the guy that identified Auschwitz as the site to become the camp. He expanded the camp. He designed and installs the gas chambers. He made weekly and daily visits to the camps. He played an integral part in creating the SS slave labor regime. Dean Reuter, thank you for joining us.
It's terrific to be on with you, Drew. I'm really happy to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
And in spite of all that, there's questions as to what happened to this guy, why he wasn't at Nuremberg, and what might have happened, and what was the duplicity of the American government in his disappearance.
Yeah, that's an open question that we solve. Actually, we answer that question in the book, The Hidden Nazi. But conventional history had it that Hans Kammler, this all-powerful, all-evil Nazi general, at the end of the war, found himself trapped, walked off into the woods and shot and killed himself. And consequently, he's escaped attention. He escaped the Nazi hunters. He escaped the attention of historians. And until myself and my researchers got on his trail, he was just as obscure as you can imagine.
The usual interviewer's question, but I really need to ask it, is how did you get onto this guy? Why did you find him? Why, what made you interested in him? And, now that you've brought him to light, I get the interest, but if he was so obscure, how did you know to go put the lens there?
Yeah, at first I wasn't interested in him at all, Drew, and I can tell you that it was a friend of mine. You see on the cover of the book, 3 names, mine and Keith Chester and Colin Lowry. Well, Keith Chester I've known since high school. He approached me as a lawyer and asked me to draft a collaboration agreement between him and our other co-author, Colin Lowry. The two of them had independently been researching this Nazi general, Hans Kammler. And Keith described this to me, and I thought I can draft a collaboration agreement, give it to him, and it's no skin off my back. But as I did that, he started to feed me bits and pieces of information about this guy, this Nazi general. And I had to tell you, I was incredibly skeptical because he laid out this rather fantastic story. And
Right.
This is, 10 years ago. So it's 65 years after the end of the war. And my cynical mind thought there is no way that such a fantastic, untold story of World War II can remain, especially what I know about Washington. You can't keep a secret in Washington.
Right,
and yet
right.
this guy had been kept a secret somehow. So
and you first
that's how
have
I
to
got interested initially, and we just went from there.
And you first have to know that they never found a body, never found a dog tag, never found evidence of his suicide, which is sort of where the story opens, right?
It does. And that's just, I got to tell you, he was, Hans Kammler was an Obergruppenführer, which is the highest rank you can attain as an officer in the SS, the Schutzstaffel, which is your listeners probably know, the dreaded inner circle of the Nazi ideology. They were the worst of the worst. And Hans Kammler was elite among that group. He was the only man elevated to that rank in the final year of the war. So he really was among the elite, and his rank was equivalent to that of George Patton. So as you know, when you end up with no body, no dog tags, no sidearm or paperwork returned, and even a post-war search for his grave turns up empty. And this is a guy who's equivalent to the rank of George Patton. It's like, it kind of raises the hair on the back of your neck. If nothing else, it raises an eyebrow or two. And that's where the book took off, when we put those facts together and realized this is not adding up. And then as we learned more and more about Kammler, we realized he's not the kind of guy to commit suicide. He's the kind of guy to lay an elaborate plan to maybe fake his own suicide and escape justice. That's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, and it doesn't strike me. My sensibilities don't line up with the notion that it was just that he found the right person to hide him. There must have been something motivating the government to do this. That he must have been providing something that they traded for his survival or something. Did you get any of that?
Oh yeah, we document what we call the Kammler deal. He was very true, as you mentioned in the opening. In the first parts of the war, the middle parts of the war, the middle years, he was, I would say, he was one of the key components, one of the key actors in the Holocaust. As you mentioned, he cited Auschwitz. He's the one who decided that Auschwitz should be the major killing camp and the major slave labor camp of the Holocaust. He then is the one who designed the concentration camp barracks and then designed the gas chamber and the ovens and installed them not just at Auschwitz. And as you mentioned, he was there daily and weekly. He reproduced that work throughout the Reich. There were almost 1,000 concentration camps, and those were all the handiwork of Hans Kammler. And he did all of this, Drew, after having toured the Eastern Front. He followed the advancing German army, and he studied the different ways the Einsatzgruppen, these terrible killing units of the Nazis, were killing people. They were using gassing trucks. They were using some fixed gas chambers. They were using rifles to shoot people individually. And Hans Kammler made this tour and figured out the most effective way to kill people. And that's what he perfected at Auschwitz.
It's incredible.
And we lay all of that out in detail. So he's precisely not the kind of guy that you would expect the Americans would do a deal with.
Right. It makes me wonder, was he cooperating with them during the war or something? Or what was it? What do you surmise?
Well, we don't even have to surmise, Drew, because that was his record in the first, 80% of the war. The last 20% of the war, because of his success in executing and prosecuting the Holocaust, he's noticed and elevated and becomes in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons. Now, Germany is known for losing the war, of course, but they had these fantastic, highly advanced secret weapons. We found some strains of nuclear research that have never been exposed before. But the real finding in our book, they had a Messerschmitt 262 jet aircraft, which had never been deployed in battle before, a jet aircraft. You think back to World War I, just 20 years before that, they were using biplanes and they weren't really bombing. But by World War II, the Germans had perfected jet aircraft, but they also perfected missiles. The V-1 rocket, the V-2 rocket. I don't know if you've heard of either of those, but the V-2 particularly was revolutionary for its time. And Hans Kammler was in charge of the research, the building, and even deploying in battle the V-2 rocket.
And that was Wernher von Braun, right?
26-foot tall rocket that traveled at supersonic speeds, about 3,600 miles an hour, and could be launched from mainland Europe, 350 miles into London or Southampton. Later, they used it in Antwerp, and they terrorized people with it. And it was that technology, in the end, that Hans Kammler could bring in a trade with the Americans. And that was our sort of acting theory of the book. Of course, his suicide doesn't make sense. If he had this elaborate deal lined up with the Americans, right, to rehabilitate himself, to erase his Holocaust past, and turn over the Nazi scientists, why would he then kill himself? We know we got the Nazi scientists. They came to the United States. Wernher von Braun, you probably heard that name. He came to the United States along with another couple hundred Nazi rocket scientists. But,
yeah, no, they all came here to Pasadena. We're at Caltech, and a lot of them were. Some of us went to MIT and Princeton, and that was it. But the V-2 was Wernher von Braun, right? That was his thing, wasn't it?
It was, and Wernher von Braun came to this country. It's always been assumed that we just sort of we the Americans stumbled on the German rocket team, and we were happy to have them, especially to the exclusion of the Russians. But Wernher von Braun became an American hero in this country. He toured the country with Walt Disney. He became essential at NASA. He helped get us on the moon. He helped develop our ICBM. And I think without that German rocket team, you can make a pretty decent argument that we might not have won the Cold War. And therefore, it was really essential to have this rocket team. And if you study the war, you know that fully a year, maybe even a year and a half before the war ends, everybody knew Germany was going to lose. Everybody knew Germany had advanced technology of many, many different kinds, and that there would be this mad scramble, that we would be trying to get these rocket scientists and all the other technology before the Russians could get it. And even, I was interested to learn, and doing the research for the Hidden Nazi, even before the French and the English could get the technology.
Maybe there's another book here on yours. I think there is a couple books on this already, but maybe a new book from your perspective on the Nazi rocket scientists. Quite literally, where'd they go? What the deals were made? What do we know about that?
Well, we found some very new information that's never been disclosed before about Wernher von Braun in particular. I mentioned he's become an American hero. We found interrogation reports, Drew, from years after the war, where the FBI was interrogating Wernher von Braun, and he disclosed for the first time ever that he had hidden documents in Germany, Nazi rocket research documents, never disclosed them to the Americans, and was pretending to be our friend and our ally, and in fact working for us by this point in time, and still hiding documents from the Americans.
Weird.
We also found that, and the idea that they were working on an America rocket, called an America rocket, Amerika, that was known before the book The Hidden Nazi. This was a rocket that was designed to fly from Germany to the eastern seaboard of the United States. And in this interrogation report, though, he reveals for the first time ever, never been reported before, that he considered marrying that America rocket with a biological weapon, a chemical weapon, a nuclear dirty bomb. So you've got this American hero that's thinking about bombing the United States with weapons of mass destruction.
Well, this is the part about this, the view of history from the victor, which is that it was all out war in World War II. People were willing to do anything to kill people, period, and win. Anything, including dropping an atomic bomb. Eventually, that's what we did. And it's really, it's been so romanticized in Hollywood and whatnot, and even in the history books, that I think people forget. I mean, if you were on one side, you were going, it was kill or be killed, wasn't it? I mean, that's how they were thinking about the whole operation. However, let me just say, even though that it seemed to have been an all-out war, and that's true, one of the reasons I was interested in talking about to you, and I think this is the time for me to sort of bring this up, I recently revisited Viktor Frankl, and I was reading Man's Search for Meaning, and Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist that was in Auschwitz and a couple other concentration camps, and he tells his story. And I'd heard obviously a million times about Viktor Frankl and his, search for meaning and his logotherapies and all this stuff. But I never read the book. And I read the book a couple weeks ago. And maybe it was a defense against the horror of the whole thing, but I found myself confused at what the Germans were doing. Why did it have to be so horrible? Why did it have to be starvation and lice and no shoes? What were they doing? What was the point? Why not just kill people, I guess, which is what they did 19 out of 20 times. But what did this, and this dude is the guy that created it all. So what did he think he was doing?
Well, that's a great question, Drew. And we actually get into that in some detail in the book. Kammler had written in 1933, he wrote a treatise about in which he envisioned Germany expanding to the east and conquering eastern territories, Poland, but Ukraine, the Baltic states, and on into Russia. And in this expansion, he envisions not just ruling the population, but replacing the population. He envisions the annihilation of 20 to 30 million people so that those lands could be populated with ethnic Germans. He had envisioned a German utopia that spread from Germany as far east as you can imagine. That was his vision, and that was a vision shared by Adolf Hitler. As that vision began to be realized, I mean, you have to remember, Germany took vastly more territory in World War II than it ever did in World War I. But then it began to get clobbered by the Russians, and it began to retreat. And at that point, it seemed that Hitler's second vision was the annihilation of the Jewish race. And he's on record as saying, if we could do nothing more, even if we lose this war, the favor we will do to the human race is to get rid of as many Jews as possible. And that became the imperative. Now, and so you have these camps that were set up by Kammler that were at the ready with gas chambers and ovens to do two things. And the two things are a little bit in tension. And we talk about this at a lot of length, at great length in the book. One thing is the absolute annihilation of Jews. As soon as they come into the camp, kill as many as possible. And that was done with the infirm and the young and the those that weren't able-bodied. The most able-bodied were put in other parts of the camp and became slave laborers. But part of that compromise is to use those slave laborers in a way that would ultimately work them to death. They were put to work.
Yes, that was what they clearly were doing. What does that do for anybody? Why not just be more direct with the killing? It's just such a confusing, the magnitude of it. It's just like, what were they doing? What you always think about it and you shake your head. It's like, oh, it's terrible. But then when you really hear the day in, day out, misery is not a strong enough word, horror of the whole thing and the way they were treated and what they were asked to do. And they were just on the verge of dying all the time with frostbite, with typhus, with et cetera. I just thought, what does the suffering accomplish? Certainly they're no condition to be laborers. I don't know what kind of work you get out of them. So it's not like they're getting something productive from people that can't walk. And then the misery, Help.
I would push back just a little bit on what you said. They were maintained at the outset in a way that would provide useful labor, and that was the compromise. That was the goal, that we could get something out of them towards the war effort, because every German man and even young men and boys were at the front, leaving nobody behind to run the German economy. So these slaves were put to use and were productive in munitions factories, building armaments and building warcraft for the German war economy. Now, and you're right. I mean, they would drive them to a point where they became unproductive, but that was part of the goal as well. And they would just replenish with more and more Jews, more and more prisoners of war, more and more conquered peoples. And it wasn't an endless supply, but it was a regime of horror, as you say. You know, it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind, like trying to contemplate infinity to get your head around.
Yeah, that's exactly what it feels like. That's right. Yeah, the confluence of one, or the nature of infinity, and what the hell humans were doing with this. I mean, I guess, you know, when you think.
Let me tell you.
Go ahead.
Let me tell you one story about Hans Kammler that I just think it's appalling, it's ironic, and it's how I concluded he had no redeeming characteristics at all. But he was a family man and married. He had 5 children, and one of his children, a girl, died as an infant in an accident in a hospital where a nurse left a bottle of chloroform open near the child, and the child was gassed. And you might think somebody would snap back to reality and reform, or somehow that would be some sort of a wake-up call. But with Kammler, it did not work. He still, even in the later stages of the war, he was pushing to kill more and more and more people.
It's incredible.
Even when the war was woefully lost.
Yes, I'm looking at my restream here, and Stephanie reminds me that I'm having cognitive dissonance. It's more than cognitive dissonance. It's more defensive disbelief, I think, because when I think about, when you think about torture through human history, it's not like there's not been a ton of it. There's been a ton of it, but it usually has logic to it. Like there's a logic there. Like you're trying to punish somebody that did something, or punish a people that did something, that were associated with something, or you're trying to make an example so you can control another group. Some logic there. Yeah. I found myself reading about the camps and just thinking, I can't. What? And for him, by the way, it was like 4 years for Viktor Frankl, and the whole time at subsistence, he had bread and soup every day, and no shoes, and frostbite, and typhus, and lice, and no clothing. They would take the clothing off the dead people as they died and wrap them around themselves. And I just thought, what it's nihilism. It's like it really doesn't accomplish a damn thing.
It is. In doing the research, I realized, and I read even, that in earlier regimes of other conquerors, the defeated were enslaved. It was not uncommon. But the slaves were treated in a way that they were supposed to be productive and to thrive.
Right. They were used. They were literally used as slaves, not used
that is a horrible outcome, but it's not as horrible as just being ground to dust. I agree with you.
And is that
it's impossible to justify, and it's very difficult to understand.
And so what I'm kind of struggling with is it out of this guy's imagination? Did he walk into those camp and think to himself, this is exactly the level of misery I want to sustain to these people. I hate them so much, or it'll show an example, or it'll get the rest of them. What would he think to himself when he went in there?
Well, that's a great question. And I even write, I wrote this in the first person, and I'm wondering, and these thoughts are going through my head, and I posed the question for the reader: what happened when Kammler came home at the end of the day to his wife? And his wife said, "How was your day, honey?"
Yeah.
And he'd been involved literally in killing tens of thousands of people. But there's another, point of fact that is a bit illustrative. It doesn't go to motivations, but it goes to the crassness of it all, where Hans Kammler has designed the barracks. There are supposed to be 550 people in there that can live in there. And in the margin, he strikes through 550 and puts 770. So just like that, he takes what's an impossibly crowded situation and adds another couple hundred people, increasing the misery by 30%. And people, ironically enough, they end up with a space that is equivalent to a coffin. So,
but you know what Viktor Frankl says? He said when they did that, he actually chronicles a little bit of that, and he said we were so passive, they were completely beaten. They just would go with it. They were eventually found it to be an improvement because the body heat of everybody next to each other was better in the winters. The problem was, he said, the problem was everyone had lice and was scratching, so you'd keep each other up scratching, but the heat was welcomed. And that's something. Isn't that crazy?
It is crazy, but I write in the book that these conditions were set intentionally to make people deteriorate and ultimately to kill people. That was the compromise between the people that wanted to kill the Jews and the people that wanted to use them as productive members for the war economy.
Do you think there was a political sort of thing being done? Maybe it was the ones that wanted to kill them were angry at the ones that wanted to use them and said, "All right, you want to use them? Try this." See how useful they'll be. So let it, in an attempt to get them to eventually let them kill everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I just know that it was Kammler who sort of straddled the line between these two camps and came up with this idea that, we'll kill the infirm and the young outright, but the others we will use as slaves and then kill them in the process.
Right, kill them in the process is the part that's so crazy.
It's bizarre. Bizarre.
So let's go back to the mystery. So yes. You track him down. Where is he?
Well, here's what we learned. I mean, that suicide doesn't make sense with our hypothesis that he did a deal with the Americans. And we really began to feel strongly that he did a deal because the V-2 rocket emerged on a battlefield in October of 1944, about 10 months before the end of the war. A month after we first saw the V-2 on the battlefield, the United States signs a deal with GE in November of 1944 for GE to make the Americans a V-2 rocket. In December of 1944, a month after that, Hans Kammler's emissaries are meeting in Portugal with representatives from GE on neutral territory. And then a month later, in January, 2 months later, really, Hans Kammler moves the rocket team, moves 4,500 people from northern Germany, where the Russians are advancing, to central Germany. And they're housed in central Germany for a while. But then Hans Kammler realizes we've had the Yalta Conference where we're dividing up Europe, and that's going to be in Russian territory. So Hans Kammler, at great risk and expense, and after the Nero degree, he moves the whole rocket team again down to Bavaria to within a week's march of the advancing U.S. Army. So that's the sort of tightly sequenced series of events that we call the Kammler deal. He delivered them. And it really comes together when we discover documents that show that Kammler's suicide was faked. He did not commit suicide at the end of the war. He actually surrendered to the U.S. Army, and we had him in custody for at least 11 months. We have documents that show he surrendered in May of 1945, didn't commit suicide.
Where was he?
In Prague. In Prague. And then, if you recall history, Germany was contracting, the Third Reich was contracting, they lost Berlin, and they end up basically in Bavaria and Western Austria and Western Czechoslovakia. And
I didn't know they hung on. I didn't realize they'd hung on to that because the original Lebensraum notion moved into Czechoslovakia very quickly. That was their original move.
It did. They got through diplomatic means. They got Austria and the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, and then later all of Czechoslovakia.
That's right.
Without a shot being fired.
Right.
And it was after that they invaded militarily Poland. But Kammler, he didn't die at the end of the war, and we have him being interrogated in central Austria after the war about missing Nazi funds. We have him in central Germany, where the rocket team was, the remnants of it, probably searching for scientists who had stayed behind, maybe helping to search for documents. We even have him in Nuremberg on the eve of the Nuremberg trial.
Wow.
And then in February and March of 1946, so this is 8 months after the end of the war, 8 months after his supposed suicide, the Americans obviously know he didn't commit suicide. They've never disclosed he didn't commit suicide or that we had him in custody. There is the final two documents in the files that we could find, a extradition request from Great Britain They wanted to try Hans Kammler because he had used this V-2 rocket to mercilessly bomb London and Southampton. And there's a note in the file that says there's no objection to his extradition. And then, poof, the paper trail just runs out. It's as if Hans Kammler had never existed at all. There's no further mention of him anywhere.
And where when you say these papers and the documents, how did you get at them? Where were they? What kinds of documents?
Yeah, those are great questions. Those documents in particular came from U.S. Army files in the U.S. archives of the national government. Our whole collection of files, because we have files on so many different aspects of this, came from all over the world. Colin Mowry, I mentioned, is in Europe. He was getting files from archives there. Keith Chester was getting U.S. archives files, but we did a lot through Freedom of Information Act requests. We got a lot of documents from online now. You can get a lot of documents, but we got a lot of documents from small libraries, Air Force bases, Army bases. These documents are pretty thinly scattered. So if you have, for example, a colonel who was in charge of sweeping through Germany looking for nuclear weapons, and he retires and becomes a professor at University of Indiana, his papers are there. So you've got to go there to try and get his papers. I went to Germany a couple times and got to interview Hans Kammler's son, which was sort of you talk about a surreal experience. That was a once in a lifetime kind of experience to walk into his house.
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you because I have now a billion questions. So first of all, let me go back to the documents because I want to talk at length about the son. The documents. I mean, is it? I can't imagine what that's like today. It's not like you're going into a, Dumbledore's library and pulling shit. Is it, do you look up Kammler in the files of University of Indiana and what they have is already collated and comes up on a computer? How's that work today?
Yeah, it is a mishmash, Drew. It's some things are still on microfiche.
Oh yeah.
And there are microfiche indexes which give you a general idea. It could be the records of the counterintelligence corps, a certain aspect of it that was in Prague shortly after the war. So you start looking through their records.
Wow.
Some of it is just in folders, and they will bring you at National Archives, for example, they'll bring you as many as 24 banker boxes full of material at a time on a cart. And then you just start rifling through that.
Do you imagine that he's down in San Diego with Whitey Bulger, or what's your fantasy about what happened to him? You know what I mean?
Yeah, another good question. And I mentioned that the paper trail runs. So from that point forward in the book, we admit and we know we're speculating. But we're making some very sound guesses, I think, based on other known cases. And there's one case in particular, a case of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. You might have heard about him.
Yeah.
You've studied history. He was the butcher of Lyon. He operated in Lyon, France. He's head of the Gestapo, tortured people, was wanted by the French after the war. We, the Army, U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, were using him as an intelligence asset to help us gather information about the Russians for 3 or 4 years after the war. And the French kept saying, we want him. We kept saying, we don't have him. Finally, we sent him off to South America, where he lived comfortably until the 1980s. He was brought back, tried, convicted, sentenced to prison, and died in jail. But because it was such a big, international event, the U.S. government, our Department of Justice in the 1980s, researched what had happened. And there's a pretty good tight paper trail on Klaus Barbie. And it turns out that the Army CIC, the same unit of the Army CIC, the same Lieutenant Colonel, Dale Garvey of the Army CIC, that was signing the paperwork of Klaus Barbie, is signing the paperwork of Hans Kammler. So that's the closest thing we can come to the same type of case. So for that reason, we think he went to South America. But he might also have come to the United States, as many Nazis did. He might have stayed on the continent, as many Nazis did. He might have been turned over to the Brits after that extradition request and just quietly taken into a field and shot and killed, for all I know.
And when you say South America, are we talking about Argentina?
Bolivia, Argentina. I mean, there was, we came across a 1953 CIA report, Drew, that talks about German enclaves down there. The CIA was terrified about a Fourth Reich because there were German Chamber of Commerce, thousands of Germans down there, many of them just, rank and file officers or soldiers, many of them just private citizens, but they had the science, they had the means, they had the gold and the currency, and that even a German Chamber of Commerce to launch a Fourth Reich. Thankfully, that never came to pass.
Wow. Did not realize that was a potential. So now let's get to Kammler's son.
Yes.
So you walk in the house. What do you see? What do you think? What do you
I have
feel?
to say, by way of setting this up, I had exchanged emails with the son, and he had not agreed to see me, but I was in Germany. I decided I will take an hour train ride, get in a cab, and I just showed up on his doorstep, knocked on his door.
Wow.
And I described this at length in the book because it's so chilling. I get goosebumps when I think about it. I'm walking up, I see a woman in the window. She's older. This guy's older by now. George is his name, the German George. She lets me in after some, negotiation back and forth. And we walk through a kitchen, dark, very pedestrian, everything old, nothing brand new. And we walk into the front parlor, also darkened, and in a hospital bed, reclined, sits George Kammler, in a pose that is strikingly similar to a pose I have of his father that appears in the book.
Wow.
When his father's in uniform, but he's got the same sort of lanky, long, lean body that his father had.
Wow.
And we had a conversation that went on for quite some time about, all aspects of his father's behavior. But walking in there, Drew, I didn't know if this guy thought his father was an absolute hero, and he might had a back room full of Nazi memorabilia and an altar or something like that, or whether he thought his father was a war criminal or something in between.
So, and was this all in German or English?
This was all in English. All in English.
So everybody spoke English in that household. Yeah,
they did.
So that's interesting just by itself. And so let me guess. I'm going to guess that the son said something on the order of, I have not read your book yet, though I'm dying to, on the order of, yeah, maybe he did some bad things, but he was just doing his job. That's usually what you hear in these things.
Yeah. Well, that's you've sort of encapsulated what's called the Nuremberg defense. I was following orders. I was just doing my job. Coupled with the idea that if I didn't do it, somebody else would. So he said, there's a couple quotes in the book. One thing he said was his father was in it up to his eyeballs, which was a pretty frank admission that he knew his father was guilty. He also, though, equivocated and said, his father had deadlines. His father had things he had to do. There was a structure in place, and he was part of a structure, and he was more or less forced to do this. So, but in defense of George Kammler, it's a difficult thing. I mean, he was 5 years old when his father supposedly committed suicide.
Right.
It's a difficult thing to grow up as the child of a terrible, terrible human being. I mean, I can't imagine that.
Did he cop to any of that? Did he sort of say it was miserable for him, or that he had regrets, or?
What he said was one of the things he said was it was a difficult household. But there he was alluding to the fact that the father was missing, and his mother was the one who had his father adjudicated dead by a German court. So she went to court to have him adjudged dead so that she could get military benefits, survivors benefits. She still had 3 children alive, so she had to feed them. But it's very, very clear that she lived to 1996, Drew, in George's household. So they grew up together, more or less. But for 50 years, she did not remarry. 51 years really, after the supposed suicide of Hans Kammler, that she went to court to have proved. But it's very clear that George did not believe the suicide. He was asking me for information about the ultimate fate of his father.
And did you have that at that point?
We didn't have exactly what we needed at that point. We had bits and pieces, but not enough that I felt like I could share it with him. One thing I did share with him was, I thought interesting. George was the 5th child, I think, and I had found a birth notice that Hans Kammler had filled out in his own name. And by this time, he had already lost 2 daughters. And yet he wrote down that George was his 5th child. So even though 2 of his daughters were dead already, he's still, Hans Kammler, that is, in his mind, he's counting them as his children. And I don't know what insight that gives you as Dr. Drew, but to me, that says he's still accounting for those children. He's still considering those human beings. He still has some love or affection, or at least acknowledgement of them, in giving, George the 5th position.
Yeah,
I thought that was interesting, and I was able to share that with George, but I didn't have much that I felt like I could share with him.
And I need to read your book in more detail to know, some of, as I saw somebody quote the other day, is that, I need to read more about it to see if this guy's a true psychopath or just effectively a psychopath. And I read a quote the other day that was deeply insightful, which is that the horrors that humans can bring upon an outgroup through history are simply unlimited. And so a psychopath is someone who treats the in-group the way people at war might treat an out-group. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. That makes perfect sense. And I can speak to that a little bit because, I tried to learn as much as we tried to learn as much as we could about this man. And I definitely did not want to portray him in a sympathetic way, but I wanted to get a realistic picture of him. And what I could find were quotes from others. And these are, you have to, quotes like he was, I don't know if anybody called him a psychopath, but people said he was, all negative comments, including the worst man I've ever known, is the one comment, that one quote that sticks in my mind. But these were quotations, Drew, from people who were at war in the military, in the SS, which was itself a criminal organization. So these guys were all miserable human beings, and among them all, they thought Hans Kammler was the worst. So that maybe answers your question about how he acted within the in-group.
Yeah, and so that does, suggest at least severe narcissism, if not psychopathy, and it does call into question the numbering of the children. On one hand, I can see that as just numbering, you know what I mean? The children are just numbers. They're just, this is my 5th one, and that's it. The other 2 aren't here. Anyway, what's for lunch? It's like, it could be like that. Ugh, yuck. Yeah, when I see how some people have behaved during this pandemic, I am learned anew, or at least been newly exposed to how people can behave in non-empathic ways and in ways that I never would have predicted. And, in a situation of threat, people do stuff that is just uncanny. And I know this is a very, very light version of it as compared to what happened in Europe during the 40s. But I'd never really been exposed to it until this pandemic. And it's eye-opening when you see people start to do these things. I'm just thinking of somebody screaming at me when I was trying to get the vaccine, where are my papers? Where are your papers? And I literally, the thought bubble in my head was, this was at a hospital, and where I'm a senior staff member. And I thought, do you enjoy treating senior staff like this? This is what you enjoy? I guess so. And you give people the chance to do that, and they will do it. And they get some sort of satisfaction out of it. Now, that's a tiny little version of what we're talking about here. So any surprises in that conversation with the son? Like something jumped out at you?
2 surprises. One, I was really surprised that he thought his father was a war criminal, that he thought his father was up to his eyeballs. I was, hopefully surprised by that. I mean, I enjoyed that surprise. I was also surprised and in a disappointed way. We had been reading constantly about these life books, Lebenbücher, that Hans Kammler had left for his children. And I had envisioned these as something you would give to a 2 or 3 or 4 or 5-year-old child as a father. And I thought they would provide just great insight into him. And I wanted to walk out of there at least looking at those, maybe with copies or photographs of them. And I write in the book that they were upstairs. We were downstairs. And George Kammler spoke of them as if they were an ocean away, that it would be impossible for him to provide them to me.
Wild.
And it was clear, I mean, he didn't want me to have those. He didn't want me to have access to those. But he did say that, no, they weren't what I had envisioned. They were more a justification for his indoctrination, for his radicalization. And even so, of course, I wanted to see that. But that was a bit of a surprise.
No, you didn't get it? Didn't get there?
Didn't get there.
Oh. Are you still in communication with them? Are you negotiating or anything to try to get them one day?
He has since passed away, Drew. So, and it's interesting because he seemed much more open than his wife, who sat, he was in a hospital bed. I was in a chair that his wife had placed a little too far from the bed. So I kept scooching forward and his wife would, completed the triangle, and she kept trying to insert herself and bring the whole thing to a conclusion because she was less comfortable with the interview than he was. He seemed a little bit more forthcoming than she was, but neither one of them were completely open.
And so do we know what happened to these papers?
Presumably the wife has them. I am in touch with one nephew, a great nephew of Hans Kammler. He seems to be the only other living relative that has any interest in Hans Kammler. So I'm in touch with him, and my difficulty there is he is working on a book of his own, I think. So he's, playing it close hold.
I understand. Well, it just could be such a trove of interesting. I mean, see, when I hear the son say up to his eyeballs, in my mind, I convert that to mean he was up to his eyeballs in the philosophy and the discipline and the structure. There's the up to his eyeballs means he bought in fully to this thing. And if his papers are a defense of how that happened, it doesn't matter how defensive it is. It would be so revealing from the standpoint of how a human mind works in, say, a cult or in a war or in a, in terms of looking at how a psychopath looks at an outgroup. There's just so much to be mined from papers like that. I just hope you get it one day. My goodness. Woo. That could be something.
I hope so too. Yeah. I hope so too. And that whole point you were making about insight into his mind brings me back to something that's mystified me. My father was a U.S. Army officer, and my family, has lived in this country from the 1860s on. So we were on the good guy side of World War II. But because my dad was an officer, I happened to be born in Heidelberg, Germany. And all of my DNA is German and Austrian. And I have this bizarre, and I even write about this in the book, sort of this bizarre sense of guilt that, it was my forebears who were the evildoers in World War II. And I spend a little bit of time in the book trying to figure out how the Holocaust happened, how World War II happened, what was the cause of one of the most highly cultured and advanced societies, not just at that time in history, but in the history of the world.
Ever, yeah.
Just running completely off the rails. I don't think I get to a very satisfactory answer other than to say it clearly happened by increments. And it was an interesting phenomenon that's pretty well documented, that it starts out, Jews can't live in this neighborhood. And all of a sudden it's like, you can convince yourself you're doing your Jewish neighbor a favor by buying their house at 50 cents on the dollar.
Right.
And you get these secondary benefits. And the whole system seemed to be set up and work that way, that as Jews were being excluded, others, of course, their lives were being enhanced. And enhanced in a way that they were able to tell themselves they were being friendly to the Jews themselves.
Right.
In bad circumstances. And that seemed to be the way the momentum built.
And it seemed to me, again, I don't know a lot about the how this. I mean, there were sort of two forces I saw. One was the trauma of the First World War, which was God knows what that did to the children coming up during that time. Then the massive burden that the world put on Germany, right, with all the debts that they owed, and then the massive hyperinflation and the resentment that the Germans had as a result of that, and then the fear of the communists.
Right.
And so it seemed like those were sort of the things that were in the winds that were causing people to behave in ways that they normally don't.
Yeah, that's well put. That was the perfect storm. And it was the Treaty of Versailles that placed all those burdens on Germany, and they really felt mistreated.
Yeah.
And at the highest levels, at the level of Hitler and the government officials, the Treaty of Versailles also severely limited the size of their army and navy. And they began to buck at that, saying we're defenseless, basically. It's unfair to make us defenseless. And that's the excuse they used to violate the Treaty of Versailles, stop making war reparations payments, and just started building a super army that, when they used it, it crushed Poland and the lower countries and France.
Again, we've seen some of these psychological winds a blowing in our own country lately when a group feels like put upon and sidelined and ostracized, then they bring in a leader. I'll show you. Here, take this, and that feels good. it's sort of a little version of that we've been kind of dealing with here, and I think it's why everyone is so spun emotionally by the back and forth we've gotten into. But yeah, what do you want people to go ahead? I'll let you to make the comment. Then I want to know what you want people to take away from the book.
I'm conflicted myself about if you try and contemporize things, and I on the one hand I feel like we all need to be vigilant. That's one of the lessons of the Holocaust, and that's one of the takeaways here. That I do believe that if you ignore history, if you don't learn history, you're bound to repeat the mistakes of history. So I think that's important. On the other hand, you can probably go back over the last 75 years and find many, many instances of where there were people grabbing power and abusing others and taking advantage and mistreating people, and it never led to the next Holocaust. So you have to be careful about saying this is it. This is the lead up to the next Holocaust or the next tyrannical government, or the end of Republican democracy as we know it.
Right, I agree. I think to declare things, are going to be a certain way in terms of catastrophe, and or to indulge in conspiratorial thinking, but both too extreme. You're not likely to be connected to reality with that. But it does bring up an interesting question though, which is, I've been telling people for the last year or so that if, say, 4 or 5 years ago, someone sat in my office and told me that they want to go track down some Nazis and there's a Russian operative in the Oval Office and they're convinced maybe he's a Nazi, I would put that person in a psychiatric hospital. And yet that became like, that kind of delusional process became common discourse in the press even. Do you have any thoughts about that? I mean, why all of a sudden, 3 minutes go by before Hitler's name is mentioned, Nazis are talked about as though they're going to be marching down my neighborhood any minute. What do you think that is?
Drew, I'm not sure. And what's striking about it is this is happening in an era where we have probably the best standard of living of any country in history. We have more prosperity. I mean, there are people living at the poverty level, but they're probably in better shape than middle class people were in the 1920s.
Oh, for sure.
I don't know.
For sure. Yeah. And this stupid thing, it gives us, we have more in our hand than MGM Studios had on their entire lot.
That's very true. So the closest I can come to explaining it, or I don't know if this is even a valid insight, but I've seen the way people behave to each other in cars. It's as if there's not really a human being there. You can get rageful. You can make obscene gestures to people, yell at the top of your lungs in the comfort of your own car. And the internet and Twitter and a lot of interactions that happen online have the same sort of feel to me, where you're yelling at people or typing in all caps. You wouldn't do that to somebody in a grocery store. Right. You wouldn't treat somebody like that face to face. You would see that they have a child there and they're a parent and they're a human being just like you are. So the internet, as great as it's been, it's created some distance and some anonymity that I think people use to express their worst sides.
Yeah, that is that out-group thing again, that we, if you don't identify as something alike, and it's so primitive. It's like we need to, that's why I've been calling for a rational revolution, that rationality needs to prevail again. It's not even an emotional, I used to call upon emotional sort of insights into progress, but now I feel like rationality needs to prevail, even if it's just to confront your own tribalism and to look how silly and primitive that is. So I don't know. So my wife ran and got me a book while we were on. This is written, Susie, you want to introduce this book?
That was written by my great uncle, Wojtek Seiler.
In Prague.
He was not Jewish, but he was a local doctor in the Prague area, near there, about an hour outside. And he was on a list because he was trying to help people stay out of the Nazi war camps.
He
Anyways,
was helping Jewish people.
He ended up getting captured and thrown into the one in the Terzen area. I don't know how you say that, but anyways, he tells a story about how, you know, he ends up becoming the lead doctor, and he watches how they treat the Jews. And then this was the camp in that area that right before you went to Auschwitz. So he just watched basically, you know, all the Jews get just treated poorly. They were all in camps. They all had to work. They were using him as a doctor, but he also had to pick up stones and, you know, whatever. And it was, you know, it was a living hell. He lived through it, wrote the book. And, you know, the rest of my family stayed intact in Prague area. I met them in my 50s. I didn't know them then because we kind of got separated because my family came to America first when my grandfather was 18. So, but the satellite of all these camps and the way the Nazis came in and just took over all these cities at the same time is just, it was astounding. Like they, you know, and then when the communists came, it was another story. But it astounds me that they had that much power and were able to take over so many cities. And
then this thing they did with these camps and stuff were just hard to.
They're horrible.
Hard to understand.
If anybody wants to read what it was like, you can get the book.
It says, let me read it quickly. Not simply a dry chronological record, but a riveting story dedicated to the young who did not experience the occupation. The passage of time has made it possible for the author to produce a true and trustworthy account of everything he experienced and saw and heard in the small fortress, which was the camp at the time. Which is, in a way, what you've been able to do. Same idea. The passage of time allowed you to get access to all this stuff. It's amazing that you can put it all together. It's amazing.
Yeah, it was a challenge to stitch it together in a story. And you asked me what my takeaway here is. I don't know if I have a single takeaway. It's clear the work is not done. I think somebody that reads this book hopefully is going to realize that their grandfather mentioned Hans Kammler, and they've got a box of documents in their attic. I mean, it really comes down to that sort of lucky strike.
Yeah.
We I mentioned we did a lot by Freedom of Information Act request. There were two documents. We made a request of the U.S. Army and the FBI, and you will almost get back a document that has a bunch of redactions, stuff taken out. Right. What we got in response to that, and this was for documents of Hans Kammler, about Hans Kammler, two documents, total over 100 pages. We got back nothing, saying we can't give you even a redacted version. And one document was put together in 1969, the other in 1987. So these are decades, 40 years, the second document, after Kammler supposedly dead, and they're still producing lengthy documents about him. So there is more work to be done. There's more out there. I'd love a little help from somebody fortuitously in finding the next cache of documents.
Well, ask your grandparents.
Could happen.
Yeah, it could easily happen. Do you need help from FBI people, FBI agents? Would that be helpful?
We've central FBI folks we could use help from, and archivists. I don't think there's anybody left in government who cares about the cover-up. So right now it's just inertia. And my fear is that all the official records were destroyed or misfiled. We found some records in places they shouldn't have belonged. So I think we found everything that Central Archives in College Park, Maryland has, and everything that the British government has, and everything the German government has. What we're missing, and everything else has been destroyed or mislaid. We talk about the CIC in this book. After the war, they destroyed 5 million pages of documents. So we think we have everything that exists in the U.S. files. What we don't have is the documents somebody just carted off because they thought they had something interesting. And that's what it's going to take, I think.
Well, the book is The Hidden Nazi. Can we get it now, or is it on pre-order?
It's now everywhere. It's been out for a little bit, but it just came out in paperback. So you can get it in hardback and paperback, on Kindle, on Audible. It's everywhere online. And I guess if people go to bookstores anymore, it's at a bookstore.
It's the untold story of America's deal with the devil.
It's at a bookstore. Oh my God.
Yeah, how about that? Bookstores. Go to Vroman's if you're in Pasadena, because that will help him go up the New York Times review of books. Dean, thank you so much for joining me and being so cooperative with all my million questions and musings. And it was more fascinating than I even imagined. So congratulations on the book. And Is there another? Do you have something else in the works right now that we should look forward to?
So Keith Jester, Colm Lowry, they're feeding me some more information, trying to get me interested. It's going to be tough to find a story this spectacular, but I've thought about some other things. One topic that you might very well be interested in is a book on the godsons of Adolf Hitler, the godchildren of Adolf Hitler. He had many godchildren, and I thought, what must it be like to grow up in post-World War II Germany as the godson of Adolf Hitler? He had no children we know of. So that's as close as you can get to sort of any kind of investigation or research on his progeny. So I thought that might be interesting, but I'm not sure yet.
Oh, yeah.
Well, again, thank you for joining us, and everyone go get the book, The Hidden Nazi, and I hope to talk to you again soon sometime. Great
to be with you, Drew. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Dean. And let me go to the restream here. You guys have been very, very, very active. So, Susan, we'll let Dean Reuter go, and I will try to answer some of these restream questions because you guys have been going crazy here, and you're not. A lot of talk about vaccine hesitancy. I saw. Let me see if I can get some of your questions here.
Yeah, they got to quit using those words on YouTube. We're going to get censored again.
Yeah.
But we are down to our second strike now, so that's good news. We won't be
the hospitals are the new concentration camps. I don't know that that's true. Yeah, so you asked a question about who's coming up. We have my daughter tomorrow to talk about the book. It Doesn't Have to Be Awkward. Will she be in here by then?
Yeah.
And then Thursday, Mike Catherwood.
He doesn't even know when she's coming.
Mike Catherwood, my former partner from Loveline back in the day.
Yeah.
Seriously, what's going to happen to those who refuse to be injected? Carly Pearl. Seriously, what's going to happen is those people are going to be carrying around an antiviral pill in their pocket. As soon as they get a fever or angst, they take the damn pill. Once we get that approved in another month or so, and if you're unvaccinated, beg your pardon, if you're unvaccinated, you should immediately talk to your doctor about how to set up monoclonal antibodies should you get sick. Those are the two things, and discuss whether steroids would be appropriate for you. Just past your question, it was up there. Excuse me, just a second ago. Burping and hiccuping is ridiculous. So I really believe that once we get the antiviral pills, I have one concern about the antiviral medication is that if we're only using one, we may see viral resistance develop. So we're going to need two eventually. And I hope there are three being developed. I hope they're developed quickly. And if that happens, really the plan then is for people to get vaccinated, then as many people as possible to get a mild infection with an antiviral. So people have broad immunity and vaccinated immunity, and they don't have to suffer consequences because we have an antiviral medication that prevents the viral illness from resulting to the cytokine storm, and we'll be in pretty good shape at that point.
Okay, Joshua, my great uncle, he would have been my grandfather's brother, was a Czech man who was a doctor who was captured by the Nazis because he was trying to help people stay out of the camps.
He was helping Jewish folks.
He was gathering money to help the poor, and he was on a list.
Thank you, Noel.
So they captured him, and he had to become the doctor for the entire sort of Auschwitz-like camp. But this was the one before they took him to Auschwitz. It was sort of a, the landing point before the Jews went to Auschwitz. So, and a lot of people that were in those prisons weren't all Jew either. They were both, because there were people that were anti-Nazis, and they got thrown in as well, and treated really bad. If you want to hear what it feels like, what it's like, what Drew was talking about, it's just horrific.
Just read. You can read 50 pages of Viktor Frankl, and you get it.
Yeah.
But those of you, I'm seeing lots of vaccine concern, like out-group concern. Go look at our friends in Europe and our French and English friends and what they're doing. They don't have the derangement syndromes and the tribalism that we have here, and they're being much more rational about what they're doing. They're much more collegial, community-oriented in terms of getting everybody on board and suppressing viral replication. They give people choices, either vaccine or test or show me your natural immunity. And they're just sort of collaborative about it, not so judgmental and authoritarian, which we've suddenly become, and so is Australia, obviously. So it's very strange what we're doing here psychologically.
Did I tell you my grandpa Ted, my grandmother's second husband, was also shot down in a POW in Poland?
That's what was his name?
Grandpa Ted.
Yeah. Did not. I'd forgotten about that.
He had a big plate in his head. He lived till he was about 80, though.
Yep. So again, I'm worried about outgroups. I'm worried about us creating lots of outgroups, but
those were the days.
The way to do that is to not judge and ostracize outgroups, but to convince and just persuade them to help join the campaign to reduce the replication of this virus by getting vaccinated. And if you're uncomfortable with that, be prepared to get sick. You know, prepared to find ways to stay out of the hospital.
His first name was Grandpa.
Angry Bear says medical professionals are part of the hysteria machine. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. We are. A lot of things my profession has done in this pandemic that has just been absolutely astonishing to me. Astonishing. And I would say adding to panic is one of those things. I would agree. How did I get strikes from YouTube? Miss Kaylee, I interviewed people like some of the people you're asking me to interview here, who I can't mention their name. Steve Kirsch, Kelly Victory, people like that who use words that you're not allowed to use on YouTube.
He got us the last strike,
Yeah.
but he's been trying to get on. We have to be super careful. Drew doesn't want to lose his license either, because
right. They've said that if you say
anti-vax,
anything, they've now on the record saying if you say anything other than everyone must get vaccinated, your license is at risk. Now, I do believe everyone should get vaccinated, but I'm very sympathetic to people that are hesitant, and I would like to, rather than making their position harder by being judgmental and authoritarian towards them, I'd like to try to persuade them to bring them.
But we're going to make you show your papers if you get that COVID test.
It's having had the vaccine. Listen, one element of persuasion is it's much easier to get around. It's just easier. It's the vaccine is not. Yes, there's side effects, and yes, whatever. I'm glad I took it. Why not? You know, come on, let's get going here. Let's do this.
Yeah.
And if you've never had, and that's me who's had COVID, so I didn't even really need it. But I was happy to add some added immunity. It's okay. And I had a nasty reaction to the vaccine. And I'm glad I took it.
You're still alive, though.
Yeah.
And we've flown to France and Greece, and people weren't wearing masks, and we were all together. Where were we the other day? We were in a big group of people, and it's just so, a wedding, and didn't catch COVID.
Oh, yeah, we were at a wedding. Well, but everyone was tested, and everyone had to show their vaccines, and blah, 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 blah. That's all fine.
Do we have to show our vaccines?
Didn't we?
That was for the benefit we went to.
Okay. Oh, that's right. That was the Josh Flagg thing.
I mean, there's a chance we could
and
get
I don't
it.
understand. Both events, both the thing on Friday and the wedding on Sunday, were outdoors.
Yes.
And here's how many hundreds of millions of cases of COVID have there been in the world? 200. Let's see. Number of COVID cases worldwide. Let's see what that number is, just because I want to. How do you get that number?
I'm just glad we're not living in a Nazi regime.
Oh God, yes. So it's on the order. It looks like it's on the order of 300 million ish. No, it's more than that. So let's say 400 million. You know, let's say 400 million. Nearly 500 million people. Nearly 500 million people have had this infection. 2 cases of outdoor transmission documented. 2 cases.
Is that what it is now?
2 cases out of 400 million people.
Sure?
2 cases of outdoor transmission. There was concern about Delta and outdoor transmission, but it doesn't look to have borne out. The only cases I'm aware of that were documented were 2 people that spent 10 minutes face-to-face in China and transmitted. That happened twice in China. That was out of 100,000 cases. But here now we have 400 million cases. So the idea of people being worried about outdoor transmission, I mean, just look at the football stadiums.
I mean, we went in the bathroom.
Look at the football stadiums. They are packed. They're shoulder to shoulder.
I know. It's
not
so
resulting in
awesome.
transmission. So outdoors, I think people can feel very, very confident, it seems to me. Again, younger people especially. B-World, you're saying 233 million. That I think is only in the West. If you I was just looking at some other data. There's hundreds of millions elsewhere that get thrown into the mix. Okay, so anyway, thank you guys for being here. I thought that was I don't know the Novavax status, Jesse. I keep expecting it any day, much the way I expect the molnupiravir any day. Let's see. I'm looking at your guys' comments, and I don't see anything urgent here. Rational Revolution, everybody. Thank you for being a part of that. I will be going down to, I'll be coming up in May. I'm going down to Austin in a couple of weeks.
Beep, beep.
Reunited, and it feels so good. and we will get into that. But tomorrow it's my daughter. Thursday it's Mike Catherwood. Susan, I'm going to wrap up. You asked me to warn you before I do, so here I go. Thank you for being here. We will see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Is that right? Tomorrow? It looks like 3 o'clock.
3, because you have to do Fox 11 too.
3 o'clock tomorrow. See you then. That's my daughter, Paulina. I'm Dr. Drew. We are signing these plates for those of you that have purchased signed books through Premier Collectibles.
Thank you for buying.
Thank you for getting the book. And we will just be signing these things as we go here today. And so, one of the things we were going to sort of, we're going to answer your questions and you can send them in.
We'll get to you.
The link is at the website if you want to get again, premiercollectibles.com/awkward. A lot of good questions here. We will get to some of those in a minute. We're going to talk for a few minutes though about, somebody's actually asking the question we're going to get into. Why did you two decide to write this book? Was the catalyst an awkward conversation? Was it? Not really. Really, the reason we wrote the book is we decided to do this a while ago.
2019, October of 2019.
Yeah, it was 2019, and I was approached by a group that were interested in writing something about consent. Where'd you learn all this?
I don't think you want to know the answer to that question.
I do want to know.
Trauma, nigga. I don't know.
You're right. I don't want to know.
I told you.
You're right. Sorry. This dose of Dr. Drew is produced by Susan Pinsky, and a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. The show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your physician, nor am I practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in imminent danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255 anytime 24/7. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help.